This is our final panel before we're going to turn it over to Bill Whitty to give us his wisdom on what everything we've heard this morning means. I'm really pleased to have with us Matt Horton, who's the Vice President of Research and Policy for the Los Angeles County Economic Development Corporation, was with Milken for a while, and he's going to give us sort of his overview of the economic development landscape and housing here. Robin Hughes, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Housing Partnership Network, previously with Century Housing, and then Scott Laurie, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Olson Company, a home builder. And he doesn't build on the multifamily side, but he and I have lots of great conversations. He knows just so much about housing in Southern California. It's great to have him. So thanks to the three of you. If you want to get the detailed bios, you can scan the code and you will give it, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. I do want to, I've asked all three of our panelists to take a few minutes to give their survey of the current landscape. And I'm going to start because Matt is sort of the most 35,000 foot level for LA, although maybe it should be, because it's only LA, 10,000 feet, I don't know. But let me start by asking Matt to just give some thoughts on sort of the evolution of the economy here in Southern California and how it interacts with the housing market here.
Yeah, I think a lot to pull together from what we've heard today, especially from what Sean was getting at. I think economic development-wise, we're struggled in terms of marshaling a more coordinated governance model, stuff that kind of takes or lowers the risk profile from outside investment, or even to Sean's point on like our talent, like what are we doing in terms of incentivizing business growth and retention of like key sectors. So I think that really begs a more coordinated industrial policy. So how are we positioning assets, land, infrastructure that can attract manufacturers? How do we look at the tech-based innovation that has really thrived in the Bay Area in certain sectors like biotech, San Diego, even Orange County biotech, and how do we create, there's lots of talks of a biotech corridor in LA, but what's our capacity to build more wet labs? Like the actual infrastructure that industry needs to thrive and grow and plant new startups and create new innovations. We have to be able to mobilize the types of incentives that do some of that from like an R&D tax credit or like a Cal Competes, or even on a community level, like the new markets, and really mobilize that funding to do the types of things with intention so that we're growing these sectors, that we're bringing business activity back, that we're employing people at higher levels of income that lead to, the more positive spillover effects that we see in more dynamic economies. I think the closest thing that we had to that governance model, or a more coordinated economic development governance model, was sadly with redevelopment. And not just because, I know there's a lot of detractors a bit on what redevelopment actually produced or what it was, what kind of led to, but on a core level, redevelopment lowered the risk profile for like land assembly, site remediation. So that wasn't a task that we're asking developers to do. That was something the public sector took on that really lowered the development cost. The Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District hasn't been able, or the successor to redevelopment, the Enhanced Infrastructure Financing District, still has that 20% affordable housing kind of carve out, but it hasn't been able to mobilize that détente that we need between the counties and the cities at scale to produce more housing. So we whether it's Measure A or whether it's before that Measure H and ULA, even though we have the funding, we don't have the capacity, like the people power to do the land acquisition and the capital stack, the municipal kind of finance toolbox. We need to bring that capacity back to the local sector and really structure that relationship between the county and the cities to do this kind of fundamental economic development work at the land level.
So I just want to check with when Matt talks about redevelopment, does everybody know what he's talking about? Because it went away about 15 years ago. Yeah? No? No? Okay, could you just spend like 2 minutes talking a little more
Yeah.
specificity
So
about what you're referring to.
The crux of redevelopment, how I'm talking about in this position, is the attachment of tax increment financing to do the types of pre-development types of work at like the land assembly, the site acquisition, and then the certainty of that funding of the tax increment kind of took that risk profile on investment way down. And without that certainty of that funding, I think we've seen a precipitous decline, not just in single family home production, but multifamily production around the counties. So post 2012, I think when you look at that curve, we are I think the writing is on the wall that the city's lost about $1 billion of that funding to do that work. So we're really struggling to bring some of that capacity back that enhances some of the pre-development work that just, if you ask developers to do, I think anybody in this room will say it just adds to the cost of what a per unit would be.
So Robin, you in your role get kind of a bird's eye view of what's happening in the affordable housing landscape. So if you could just take a minute to talk about what the Housing Partnership Network is for people who are not familiar with it. And then how are you seeing the evolution of affordable housing policy in Southern California play out right now?
Sure. So, good morning. It's still morning. Good morning, everyone. So as Richard mentioned, my name is Robin Hughes. I'm the president and CEO of the Housing Partnership Network. I've been in this role 2.5 years. So 2.5 years ago, I gave up my developer hat. For 26 years, I ran an organization called Abode Community, which is a nonprofit affordable housing developer based here in Los Angeles. So from my perch now, I have this wonderful opportunities of seeing how affordable housing developers are working in the space to produce affordable housing. So HPN is a membership organization. Our members are the high-performing nonprofit affordable housing developers, both rental and home ownership, as well as community development financial institutions, which are basically banks, nonprofit banks that leverage their resources from banks and from the federal government to lend to housing and community development activities. So most of our multifamily members play in the low-income housing tax credit space. And here in California, I think we have about 25 members of our 110 members, and most of those are also working here in Southern California. So when I think about what our members are seeing more broadly, significantly applies to what we're seeing here in California and Southern California. And I want to talk about two things. One, pipeline, and then the other, which we haven't talked about today, is sort of the economic headwinds and political headwinds that our members are facing that are impacting not only their pipeline, but their existing portfolios. So surprisingly, when I talk to our members, we are finding that our members have the most robust pipeline that they've had, even post-pandemic, but that pipeline is being stalled. And that pipeline is being stalled by a number of issues that you've already heard from the market rate developers in this space, including high insurance premiums, high interest rates, inflation and construction costs. All of those things are impacting pipeline right now. But in order to deliver that supply, we're also seeing our members need to access capital. So this redevelopment dollars that was talked about earlier no longer there. So our members are actually having to go out and raise their own capital to feed that pipeline. But ultimately, in order to sort of unlock this pipeline of affordable housing, we definitely need to see a shift in how we are funding affordable housing. So while it feels like in California and LA in particular, there are robust resources available to fund affordable housing, it's just not sufficient. This has been a under-resourced sector for such a long time, and we just don't have enough funding available to support affordable housing production in this space. So that is real, and it's also very complex, very cumbersome. It's sort of like stacking pennies to get to what it takes to build the affordable housing. And I will say that that's true in LA County. If you look at the fact that we have multiple housing agencies that are funding affordable housing, that you have to go through the various loops, that's a challenge. On the other hand, and folks have talked a little bit today about land use policies in the city of Los Angeles that help with the production of affordable housing. When I talk to my colleagues here in Los Angeles about EG1, for example, it is absolutely helping them get through the entitlement process more quickly. I just attended an Abode Communities event last week, and I asked their business development person how long it's taking them to get projects approved through the entitlement process down, and it's really down to 2 or 3 months.
Wow.
So it's pretty significant. And yes, these projects would have gone through the other land use tools that are available in the city, but this makes a really big difference in their ability to get their projects through the pipeline because they cannot apply for other financing until those land use entitlements are in place. So you get greater predictability, you get a shorter period of time, which means reduced costs because you're not holding on to land or other pre-development expenses over that period of time. So from a land use policy standpoint, that's been pretty significant. I do want to touch very briefly on the headwinds that our members are facing and how that, because I think we talk about supply, building more supply, but we also have to protect the vulnerable supply that I think we have in place right now. So we did a survey of our members to ask them what are the major stressors or headwinds that they're facing in their portfolio, but also what are some policies that could help to address them. So you won't be surprised by the top 5, which are property insurance, and that is both in their existing portfolio and pipeline. Our sector is still dealing with post-pandemic tenant protections, so uncollected rent still seems to be a big issue within our sector. I've already talked about inflation, and that's also in their operations where they're seeing high costs. And just going through and we talked about talent too. I think that's the other big issue that our members are facing. So we are working to think about where are there levers, either at the state, federal, local level, that can help around issues like insurance, and then what are other places where the public and private sector can come in and begin to address some of these issues.
So before I move on to Scott for his comments, I want to ask the panel a question. This, again, going to be, I asked Sean an unfair one. This is going to be another unfair one. How much does the federal funds rate have to come down before things start to pencil that are not penciling right now? Do you have any sense of that? And again, I didn't prepare any of them, so if you want to skip the question, I understand. But if you have a sense, I'd really be eager to hear it. Any one of you.
I don't know if it answers your question directly, but I've been fascinated by the market conditions that were created post 9/11 between Bush and Greenspan that really precipitated the building boom. And with really low rates, I think that there was kind of an implicit coupon that developers saw in the hands of any American because of the availability of no income, no job, no problem loans. They said, well, we'll just build anywhere, anytime. And I think a lot of local jurisdictions caught on to that and said, well, let's make it easier to build. So only to say that I think there is some
there's a
correlation.
threshold.
Yeah, I think there is some correlation between how low the rates and the accessibility of financial products with headwinds that can push building on some expanded or expedited level.
So on the affordable side, just because of how affordable housing is financed, on the construction side, construction loan interest is going to increase your development costs. On the operating side, higher interest means you're going to have a lower mortgage to begin with. So both of those ultimately end up in what's your public subsidy gap that you need on a transaction. So you're trying to fill both the cost gap here and an affordability gap. And as costs rise on one side of the lever, then it really is the gap need that's needed to finance a project.
Scott?
I'll give you a direct
Thank
answer
you.
on that. 200 on the Fed. And what happened when the Fed dropped rate 50 basis points? Interest rates have gone up 60, okay? So there's a decoupling. There's not a direct correlation. We'll find out if the Fed drops.
Right there, we're about 25 minutes
That's
away.
what I was going to say. So we
Yeah.
can answer that a little more clearly. But on the borrowing side, we were in what was called the 0% interest rate dream to infinity. I'm not sure that created all good. I don't think we're going back to that level, but we're at a point now where there is a true unaffordability because interest rates on a 30-year mortgage are around 7 today. And similar to all of you, we're borrowing where we could borrow in the mid threes. Most people are borrowing in the eights. Most, I see you have quite a look on your face. That's if you're doing a good job. You're in the eights. So there's others that are borrowing much higher, and I think it's at the margin. But we are going to need lower rates on all ends to get this thing working again.
So the worry is, and Chris Redford and I were talking about last night, the worry is if the Fed cuts rapidly, and I think it should get into the threes, but not any further than that.
I agree.
Is it will raise inflationary expectations, which is what leads to the long end of the curve going up. So on the construction lending side, of course, it helps. But on the permanent mortgage side, it's not so great.
Well, our buyers have already learned a lesson. So they would have been better off locking before the rates dropped 50 basis points than today. And so we have all these buyers that are closing now in the fourth quarter that are going to lock, and they're getting surprised. How are the rates at 7? The Fed dropped rates, but that's where they are today.
So Scott, one of the reasons you're a very creative guy, and you've figured out ways to make housing that, in Southern California, I don't think I'm going to call it affordable, but lower cost than other people's housing within the market context, sometimes working with municipalities is part of doing it. Can you tell us a little bit how you go about doing that?
Yeah, we call it attainable. So it used to be affordable. And I'm sure we'll be making up another word in the future, but I was thinking about where we have built recently. By the way, I love LA. I love the Dodgers. I love every part of LA. So yes, there's nothing wrong with LA. And I told Gino that, well, I didn't get to this part with him, but I said there's parts of Orange County that don't have great schools. They're not that safe. They have crime issues. We build in Stanton, Garden Grove. Guess what? My community in Compton is a heck of a lot safer than where we're building in Garden Grove. So, you got to get into the data a little bit. But recently where we built, Garden Grove, La Habra, Costa Mesa, Yorba Linda, Compton, Leimert Park, Glendora, Claremont, San Dimas, Huntington Beach, La Puente, Highland Park, Hacienda Heights, Alhambra, Monterey Park, Brea, Long Beach, Anaheim, Orange, San Gabriel, Temple City, Rosemead, Downey, Montebello, Buena Park, Whittier, Orange, El Monte, Santa Ana, and Torrance. So I think we have a pretty good sense of what's happening in Orange County, in LA, and what you're hearing on all ends here, we're in a housing crisis. It's literally a housing crisis. And this isn't the crisis coming out of the GFC. This is a true affordability crisis. And I keep hearing about all the people that are leaving. How about the people that are staying? How about the barriers that we've created for people coming to California? So there is a need for housing. We can lose another million. We have 39 million people in this state. We can't house 39 million people in this state. And so the challenge is really how do we get affordable? And there's a real disconnect that's going on in this state today. And the disconnect is you have an absolutely incredible entitlement environment. So I graduated from urban planning at the great University of Southern California in 1996. In my career, and having done the public and private side, it is the best entitlement environment we've seen. Unfortunately, it's at the worst time. So there is a tool chest that you can utilize today to work with cities and counties and jurisdictions. You have to know how to use the tools. And people talk about RHNA. RHNA is a big nothing. All RHNA did is it prevented cities from putting things that were in housing element 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's now going to hold them accountable. The reason I mentioned that on RHNA, it's a great thing. Cities are not required to build anything. Cities don't build. Who do they need? They need me, and they need her in her former life. There are not enough of us. We need some like multiplier ray gun to create more people like us because the opportunities are out there to build the housing that we need. The challenges are we're so late in this cycle. Rates went up on us, construction costs went up on us, and the availability of finance has become more challenging. So there's a lot of factors, and then you can talk about insurance and all kinds of other things that have gone on. So the margins have been squeezed. For a lot of people in this room, you're challenged with the current pipeline. That's really not the case with home building. People say, how are you doing? There was a gentleman named Larry Field who had a real estate development company. He used to say, I'm doing great. All the time, I'm doing great, I'm doing great. His wife said, you gotta stop saying that, Larry. We're in the 70s, there's a massive recession, people are struggling in New York. She goes, just start saying not so bad. So I'll say that in my world, it's not so bad. What does not so bad mean? Not so bad means that we've been very fortunate on the housing side. The home buyer has been unfortunate because what's happened is since we're in a housing crisis, we've pushed prices up. So prices have been pushed up and we don't have enough supply. So it is this self-fulfilling cycle and prophecy, and it's just going to continue to be unaffordable. And on the flip side of that, and then I'll turn it back to Richard, what's so interesting today, because many people in this room are struggling in other parts of real estate, we are what I would call in home building, the buyer of last resort, okay? What does that mean? Well, I will be leaving here shortly, and I'm gonna drive 15 minutes, and some of you can go try and find it on a map and buy it, to an auto dealership, okay? That would not have been used for housing before. Today, that's gonna be housing. Then I'm driving another 10 minutes into the San Gabriel Valley to look at a pretty sizable office park that is completely empty, that they want housing. This is where I'm gonna leave you. Cities never wanted housing on these sites before. Now they need housing on these sites. They do wanna fill the RENA requirements. They are being held accountable. I'm just gonna say, don't be scared. I think a lot of people in this state, they are fearful of California, of entitlement. I'm more fearful of environmental and some of the other challenges. But we are in a state right now that you can get things done, and it is a time to push. And there was this drill baby drill comment. I always say build baby build. That's what we need to do in the state, build, 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 and we're in an environment to do so. Sorry, that's my 2 cents.
So let me ask this though, is the easiest place to build is obviously on the periphery, right? Because land assembly is much easier and chances of a sequel lawsuit are actually lower, ironically. But if you look at real affordability, to me it has to include transportation cost. Is if you have the cheapest house in the world, but you're 100 miles away from a job, it's not that cheap to live there. Now, what we have seen remarkably is the Inland Empire, this phenomenon of jobs really following people. The Inland Empire used to be part of the Los Angeles metropolitan area. It no longer is. And it's not because it's seceded from it, it's because of the way the Office of Management and Budget defines a metropolitan area. What has to do with commuting sheds. And it used to be more than 35% of people in Riverside and San Bernardino counties commuted into Orange and LA counties, which is why it was considered part of the LA metropolitan area. That's no longer the case. That's why they were their own metropolitan area. By the way, if you want to win a bar bet, ask what MSA in the United States, the largest MSA in the United States, do not have a single major league team. And it's the Inland Empire. It's more than 4 million people. More than 4 million people. It's, I think, the 11th largest MSA in the US. So there, the jobs actually did follow. But in some of these other places, you think about Palmdale, Lancaster having relatively affordable housing. You think of Beaumont having relatively affordable housing. Are we seeing jobs flow to these places along with the new housing units? Because it seems that that's an important element if you want to make housing really affordable. Any thoughts about that?
I have lots of thoughts about that, but go ahead.
I was going to ask the economist person.
Well, I'm not an economist. I just play one on TV.
Play one on TV.
I think that generally that dynamic, we have one of two problems, I think, in California. Either we need to bring our jobs closer to our housing, or we need to bring our housing closer to our jobs. And they touched on this in the former panel, but I think they do a really good job of this in places like Tokyo. Tokyo has, it's not a city like LA is, it's a much larger area, but there's 40 million people that live in Tokyo, and how they build and sustain that is through an integrated network of transportation options that doesn't rely on the car. So they facilitate jobs access through public transportation in much more dynamic ways than we're able to do. And I think that speaks to kind of the missing element here in terms of co-development. So you look at some of our sites that are transit-oriented development or station stops, they don't include housing. So we're very much of a transactionary kind of metropolitan area where you get on the train and then you go home and you get back on the train to come back to your job instead of this kind of dynamic place where you live really close to where you work. So if we look at our ability for co-development at station stops, the value capture there, almost the public fiduciary dynamic around value capture at station stops, so for vertical density and infill on these sites. Like look at the regional connector station we just built down the street up on Bunker Hill. There's no housing there, and in other places around the world, like in Tokyo, that just wouldn't be the case. That'd be part of the design template to say, of course, there's going to be housing here, and then the spillover. There'll be opportunities for commercialization, small business, and commerce, all right there. So I think either we need some kind of form-based code or some kind of CEQA reform. Robin, Scott, what does CEQA trigger at the number of density for units for a CEQA review that kind of prevents some of this value capture, I think, on a vertical level? So there's
that's variable. I'll make it very simple. Raise your hand if you want to live on the coast, Malibu. Okay, now keep your hand up if you want to work in Victorville. Okay, that's the answer to that. It's great that you want to work in Victorville. I think I've built in almost every area of Southern California. Okay, back in the last cycle, I had the largest division by far. We were building 35% of all homes in the Inland Empire. I built in Palmdale, Lancaster, Cathedral City, places that, Rosamond. There's a reason that you don't have density in these areas. You don't have transit in these areas. We have a hard rule at our company. We do not go outside of LA County, and we really don't even go into South Orange County. You made a comment. When I look at urban is dirty, okay? That's not bad. It's gritty, and it's what we do.
No, I like it.
I love it.
I happen to
I
like
love it.
it.
I'm going to Monterey Park. I'm going to go have a great dim sum lunch on Rosemead Boulevard for anybody who would like to go afterward. There's great food. There's all kinds of great things happening. There's a real trade-off that happens, and here's the problem. The affordability, and the Inland Empire is great, and all these other areas, they're great. It's a different lifestyle. The affordability, it happens every single cycle. You get pushed out. And I agree, Richard, there's more service industry jobs that happened the last cycle. But when you look at where people really want to live and where the core is and where the transit is and where the jobs are, it's closer in. And that's been our model. And by the way, it's worked for a good 15, 20 years.
Wow.
So I can't help but so I live in Pasadena. And Pasadena is a rare American city in that the jobs to population ratio is 1-to-1. And typically it's 1-to-2, with twice as many people as jobs, because you have kids and old people and so on. And we have done a terrible job of building housing in my community. And people say, well, what about the traffic? And I think, where do you think the traffic's coming from? It's people who work here, who have to drive here because they can't live here. And if you had more people who lived and by the way, it's not on the coast, but Pasadena's a real nice place. If Pasadena had maintained its share of LA County population, it would, instead of having the roughly 135,000 it has now, it would have about 220,000 people. That's how far we are in a job center, and that is, I think, really critical. I want to ask a question about something, though we're going to go from the sort of big picture stuff to a really tiny picture stuff, but an important issue, which is insurance. You both mentioned it. And what I'm curious about is, are you seeing any differential pricing depending on where you're located within Southern California? And the reason I'm asking that is we know why insurance rates are going up, but they're called hurricanes, right? And global warming is, okay, if you want to leave now because of what I'm about to say, go ahead. It's here, it's real. I remember talking to a guy in Florida once and I was showing him a map of where it flooded in Florida when it didn't rain. And he said, that's not true. And I'm thinking, do you have to be up to here in water before you believe it? But okay. To me, it's here. That's why insurance is expensive, it's finally getting priced. Are there enough differences in these sorts of threats within Southern California that you're seeing some places have much lower insurance rates than others? Or is it sort of a blanket, it's just getting more expensive everywhere and sort of by the same amount? Are the increases uniform regardless of where your properties are?
So Richard, we are seeing redlining in insurance in the affordable housing sector. So it's not only where it's located, it's who it's serving. We've seen carriers exit affordable housing, SROs. They've just completely said we're not going to cover them. We have carriers asking for how many of your tenants are served under the low-income housing tax credit program versus other rental subsidy program. So we are absolutely seeing a differential in how the insurance sector is applying criteria for underwriting and choosing to insure a product. So we're seeing it in our sector.
I'm going to answer that in a couple different ways. So on the homeowners, I completely agree with you in parts, but if you're in the foothills or anywhere near fire, good luck. Yeah. So you want to have a real housing crisis, get rid of the California Fair Plan. Okay. Without that, most of us are not getting insurance, particularly in high fire. In the urban core, the insurance is much less than being up in the foothills in those areas. There's a big difference. There are parts of the United States that I think will become uninsurable. I truly believe that. I think that with climate change, everybody that was fleeing California, you might actually see people wanting to come back to California, which we need to provide housing for those people. It's actually pretty nice. I was in Denver, it was 90 something when it was 75 here, and on the news it said I think there were 60 days over 90, whatever that may be. The other part of the insurance that's a massive problem, show of hands in the room, who's paying more for insurance today than they were 3 years ago for your companies? Thank you. Okay? Squeeze the margin, just keep hitting us every which way, and we're not going to be able to build anything. It is so hard to get insurance on wrapping our projects today. That is the issue, insuring our companies today. The amounts just continue to go up. And the problem is, which is not as much on the multi side, on the for sale side, another thing that I will tell you that's going to prevent large scale, dense building on for sale, insurance. So construction defect lawsuits are coming back, and they are coming back like I've never seen. And there were state laws that were passed due to balcony inspections that is opening the door for all these law firms to come in and do destructive testing before you even knew it. And in California, we have a right to repair. And under SB 800, it doesn't even matter. And so insurance, I think, is going to be a problem on both sides. It's the homeowner, because I always say, it's not just owning the home. The cost to actually own a home and service and maintain a home is astronomical today. Forget property taxes. It's everything else that has burdened the homeowner. All of our bills, the electrical bills, the gas bills, everything else. And we have to look at that because we do build affordable. We do a lot of true affordable, subsidized, and do a lot of work with cities. It just becomes more and more challenging. And the days of the builder developer paying for everything isn't going to work. And we do all of our own entitlement, development, construction, so we see all ends of it. But yeah, insurance is a huge problem.
Well, you also hit on, but you hit on something that I hadn't thought about. But in Florida, they're also having a huge crisis with condominiums more broadly. And it basically is condo associations have been asleep. They have not been recapitalizing them. And now, I think it's as of January 1st of 2025, you're basically going to have to have a capital plan for condos that is going to require, they're saying $50,000, $100,000 per condo owner to recapitalize it. Sort of governance of condominiums has been a problem because nobody wants to do it. And we built a lot of condos in the 70s here in Southern California, so they really need these systems to be replaced, not because they were built badly, but because they're 50 years old, and things like pipes and HVAC and so on start to go at that point? I mean, I don't know if this is something any of you can comment on, but it just, Scott, as you were talking, it occurred to me that this might be another issue we face here in California.
So it's the reserves, and no one wants to be assessed. And we stay on our HOAs for 10 years to get out of SB 800. So literally we attend meetings for 10 years, and we're getting a lot of surprises. And here, most of the communities, well, all the communities are under an HOA. So they understand the reserves. You know what the problem is in California? Which is really interesting. They don't want to spend the money. So they have a surplus, and they don't want to maintain these communities, and it becomes a problem for the developer. But Richard is also correct on the other side, where you don't have the reserves or you don't have a proper HOA. We've seen failed HOAs, which becomes incredibly problematic. And it's problematic on assessing the homeowners, and it also becomes a big problem on selling your unit.
So Matt, you had a comment on insurance, and then I had a question for you. So.
Just, I've done some work on insurability that I did with Accelerator for America that you could find there. But I think the only thing that I would add to what Robin and Scott said is the sad reality is, to your point, Richard, that climate change looks like it's just going to make living a lot more expensive in a lot of ways, and maybe uninsurable in certain markets, whether on the low income side or whether on the affected area side. And I think on the affected area side, we're going to have to figure out new types of financial solutions, like akin to Mello-Roos. Everybody familiar with what Mello-Roos is? In terms, like, if you live in a really prone fire shed and you need continual mitigation and clearing of brush in order to harden that site for potential catastrophic loss, we're going to have to pay into some kind of regional local fund that supports that kind of work in order to even bring insurers or mitigate that kind of risk of insurers. So, like, on a community level, I think we're going to have to see even more types of innovative financial measures that bolster insurability.
I just can't, I mean, it could be a coincidence, but over the last year, the housing market with the biggest increase in value, according to Case-Shiller, is the Chicago market.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, maybe that has something to do with if the temperature is going up, Chicago looks like a more appealing place to live. We don't know. I'm kind of joking, kind of.
But it's very pretty. Think of what Matt just said. So Matt talked about Mello-Roos. Stan will remember this. So in the 90s and 80s, if you wanted to advertise at your community, you know what you put across the front on a banner? No Mello. No Mello. Who's paying for that? Yeah. The homeowners are paying for it. They're already strapped. So it's like, how much more can we pile on in the state, but yet we have all these problems to fix?
So, Matt, I want to come back to a comment you made in your opening remarks about biotech in LA. And one of the things that's been very striking to me is LA should be great at biotech in that it is the only city, it's the only county in America that has 3 top 25 research universities, UCLA, USC, and Caltech. It also has 2 of the finest medical facilities in the world in Cedars and UCLA. USC is pretty good too, but it's not ranked as highly as those other 2. And if you include Orange County, UC Irvine puts us with 4 in the top 50. So you look, Boston has Harvard and MIT, Chicago has Northwestern, Chicago, New York has NYU and Columbia. But there is no other city that has such a concentration of academic talent as Los Angeles does, and particularly scientific talent is Los Angeles. You go down to San Diego, and UC San Diego is awesome, but it's one place. And they have done a magnificent job developing their biotech sector. Yeah. So what is it about Southern California that it had, San Diego, Southern California, but what I'll call LA as a region, that it has not been able to successfully take this amazing talent it has and develop this industry that is developed so well just 120 miles south of us?
Yeah, I think it really gets to the intentionality that we need to see in that industrial policy dynamic. So how we get competitive in certain sectors is really a function of what I did and studied at the Milken Institute of that prosperity index, and that's a result of the investments that we're making in people and talent, but also in place in terms of infrastructure. So how are we making those investments in infrastructure that can catalyze or incentivize business formation, business attraction, business retention, because we definitely have the talent. So I think there's just a lack of that coordination on industrial policy of where we want manufacturing or wet labs, how we can partner with our universities so that we're encouraging some tech transfer in these certain sectors and retaining these businesses so they're not going elsewhere, and that we're capturing the growth from the businesses that we're incubating here. So there's a bit of infrastructure policy that plays into this around, where we can incubate more manufacturing in biotech or R&D, or how we can encourage R&D among a certain cohort of sectors that we want to see here. It just needs some coordination, I think, among the city and the county with the state of, how do we package that incentive, those incentives together to capture some of that growth.
So I want to ask Robin a question, and again, this is going to be another unfair one because I didn't prepare you for it, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. But I was thinking about, we were talking about resources. So the HUD budget is currently about $80 billion. I did a calculation. I just looked at, for every American who's spending more than 30% of their income on rent, what's the increment? And I've added them all up and come up with a number. And the number is, it would cost about $270 billion to just give everybody enough money that I'm not taking into account market dynamics, this is static, but just summing up how much money short are people of paying no more than 30% of their income on rent. And that number I came up with is $270 billion. Sounds like a huge number, but GDP in the US is about $28 trillion, so it's 1% of GDP. It's not quite 1% of GDP. To put that in some context, the country that houses people better than any other in the world is Singapore. Guess what share of their GDP they spend on government subsidized housing? It's 1%. Okay. I am guessing, given what happened Tuesday, this is not going to happen. We're not going to get a $270 billion budget in the next 4 years. So given that, where's the money going to come from? And where do you think the politics are, at least, that people are going to, because we're not going to be able to do it alone at the local or state level, even as big as California is. The resources aren't there. So where is the money going to come from? How is it most efficiently spent? See, this is a really unfair question. But give us your gut feeling about what the landscape is going to look like over the next 4 years with regard to resources.
After I rebound from the tears that you just got. So you're absolutely right. When you look at the HUD, that in our foreseeable future, we're unlikely to see the billions of dollars that we need to address the affordable housing crisis that we're facing in the city. And if you actually look at the HUD budget, the bulk of that is in public housing and mortgage guarantees, sort of very differently. The thing that we do have in Washington, D.C. is that policies like the low-income housing tax credits have received pretty bipartisan support. And as we walk the halls of the Capitol, we're typically getting bipartisan support in recognition that there is a housing crisis. And it's not just a housing crisis among low-income people in urban neighborhoods, but it's a housing crisis in suburban areas and rural areas and red states and blue states. So it's in cities as well. So I think there's a recognition that the housing crisis is impacting the middle class. It's all around. But when you then talk about solutions vary. Is there government intervention that should happen, including subsidy? Yes, absolutely. There should be maybe I used the wrong hands, but yes, there should be deep subsidy in place. So I think where we do have the possibility in next year is there will be tax reform, as many of the Trump first administration taxes that were in place then are being re-upped for 2025. So that is an opportunity for us to increase the low-income housing tax credit program and perhaps add to that a larger housing package, but it's going to be on the tax side versus the appropriation side. We're not going to see new dollars coming into HUD. So in my dream world, so one of the things that I am working on with my team and folks in DC is continuing to reimagine this housing delivery system that we have in this country in terms of how we address the housing affordability crisis and what is the next opportunity out there, regardless of who's in the seats in Congress and the White House, that is going to be the next big thing that will help to fund this sector. And I think about the IRA, that put billions and billions into sustainability. Congress didn't all of a sudden wake up to do that. There were folks working on that for years, and then there was this window of opportunity that prevailed and allowed that bill to be passed. So in my dream world, that's what we're working for. It's not the next 4 years, it's probably the next 5 to 8 years, but we have to be prepared and continue to do the work inside Congress and the White House to continue to elevate this issue and the resources needed to address it. I also think, Richard, we have to think about what's the responsibility of government at not just the federal level, but at the state and local level as well, because it is all levels of government need to be involved, and to think about what levers will incentivize private capital into this space.
So just a side note, so one of the things Robin was referring to is the Tax Cut and Jobs Act in 2017, and that expires on January 1st, 2026. And so if there's nothing passed, the tax law goes back to the way it was in 2017. Something's going to pass. I don't know what it is, but something that may be interested to people in this audience is the state and local tax deduction cap was in that. It is actually an open question whether that's going to be retained or not, because there are enough Republican Congress people in Illinois, California, New York. It's, again, my guess is it will be kept, but we don't know. It could just matter a lot to those of us in this room. I do want to ask you a question about tax credits, though. Is one of the things that the 2017 Act did is it made them less valuable, right? Because of just the nature of the other deductions that were available and treatment of depreciation and so on. What kind of gap are you, when you do a tax credit deal, when people are doing a tax credit deal, how much of a gap still needs to be filled in order to make them work?
With the low-income housing tax credits?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm gonna just do some estimating.
Yeah.
Pre-pandemic, I think the price of the gap was probably somewhere between 50 and 60% of the total development cost and I'm sorry for the technical cost, conversation, but that the 9% would fill. That is probably more 40, 50% now. So it's definitely been impacted, yeah.
So let's open it up for questions from the audience.
When I think about multifamily housing, like condo communities, like you mentioned, what should the people, deciders of how to maintain the properties, think about when it comes to water, anything and how we can keep our insurance down, but also protecting buildings when we think about climate change? Because I'm working on a big water prevention program in my condo community, just 106 units, and we're really just focusing on water right now and how to keep the waters away from the buildings.
I can touch on that. I like what you said, so everybody understands. You are trying to keep the water off of the building to prevent leaks, correct? Yes, that is a huge issue I think that we're all facing. And you talked about climate change. I have lived here my whole life. I cannot remember 2 back-to-back winters like we just had with the level of rain that we had. So the way we build, I've told our team, discussed with them, how we've built in the past has to change. The new normal has to be protection for these high weather events and the level of rain that we're facing. And you've probably seen this with your buildings. Of course, it's orientation. But then people don't realize rain can come like this. So there's a lot of things that need to be rethought, and unfortunately, it's going to add cost to the building. It may lower the insurance down the road because there are a lot of lawsuits related to water, but it's really figuring out, you can't build a perfect building. At least I haven't seen one yet, but we have to have a higher level of protection within the building, and the challenge will be with the buildings that are already constructed. how do you go back and waterproof those potentially to a higher level? There's going to be a lot to think about in how we build, I believe, going forward. And randomly, Rich, I was at Woodbury College. If anybody knows Woodbury, they have an architecture school that's pretty large. You know them, Robin. Mm-hmm. They built a 3D home, which I've seen discussed a lot. Go out to their campus, take a look at what they did. They actually built the 3D home. It's sitting on the campus. Someone's going to live in there. And I think we've got to continue to innovate and just think about how we build better.
So this gets at a broader, I'm sorry, Robin,
I was just
go
going to
ahead.
answer from a different perspective. So one of the things that we do at HPN is either start or invest in social enterprises that support our members and support our work. And so recently we partnered with a group called Prodigy Link that does water sensors. So we think a lot about it in our existing portfolio, so that at least in your older housing stock, if there is a leak behind the wall, or someone leaves their water on in the bathroom or the kitchen, at least you can begin to detect those things earlier, so that you don't experience losses, and therefore it doesn't impact your insurance. So that's another way, and I think it is a technology that can be put into newer builders, so that you get a sense of what's going on behind the walls sooner rather than later.
So I'm thinking about, because Matt brought up Tokyo, which I love, and in some ways is a model for housing, except they're a model for housing because they build housing very cheaply. And rents in the middle of Tokyo are like $1,200 a month. So not in Marunouchi, not in the highest end, but very convenient places. They're $1,200 a month. One of the richest cities in the world. How do they do this? They build crappy housing. Okay, and this is not an ugly American looking at somebody else's house and saying, oh, that's a crappy house. This is what Japanese will tell you. The walls are thin. They're very hot in the summer. They're very cold in the winter. They're very energy inefficient. But the delivery, and the reason they do it this way is their view is nothing is permanent. Between I'm trying to remember the year of the earthquake, and World War II, their view is Tokyo could be basically destroyed overnight. So why would you build permanently for this? And as a result of that, they build very cheaply. But it really is bad housing. And it's environmentally particularly problematic. And so here's the question is, how do we balance these things? We could deliver housing much less expensively than we do, in principle. How do we think about, and I've heard Randall Lewis of the Lewis companies talk about, when we build housing, it shouldn't be trying to solve other problems. It should be housing. And I'm a great admirer of Randall, but I think maybe that's a little bit of an overstatement. But how do you think about the balance between just housing is housing and the other elements that are important about housing?
Well, especially for multifamily, I think prefab and modular is not only a housing solution, but in that circular economy sense, could also be a jobs and manufacturing kind of benefits as well. So if they just did a firm I know that is in LA, Impact Housing, they just did a big or two projects down in San Diego. Everybody's singing San Diego's praises today, but you deliver that cheaper and quicker, which we like those benefits, but at the same time we're going to have to update our not zoning, but our codes. So can we do code enforcement at the factory? Can we do or how do we update or modernize the way that we do code enforcement at the production facility instead of on site? So things like that are ways that we'll have to adapt in order to embrace more modular prefab stuff.
Richard, so there are a lot of other social public benefits that we try and get from affordable housing. So I'm going to set those aside for a moment and just say, as we think about our homes and housing that we're building, it is more than shelter. And therefore, the way in which we approach it from a development owner-operating standpoint, we have to take that into consideration. So, and as we also think about the fact that people are working from home now, so the home is now the workplace. So we do have to think about how people what a housing space, a home space looks like for people. And I think that's why the quality in which we put into the housing is really critically important. I also think this country has experienced when we're not building high quality housing, especially affordable housing, what we see. So I will turn to public housing. That was built, that was supposed to be temporary housing, and what is now taken to, when we can, rebuild that and make it better quality housing, more diverse communities, different housing types. And then we think about the impact that building has on our environment. So I still think we have a responsibility as a sector to take that into consideration too. So yes, it would be great to simply build a box, but I just don't, there's so many other factors that go into housing.
Let me just add it. So I have a PhD student working on a project involving Jordan Downs. And I would encourage anyone to go down and visit, because the neighborhood transformation is remarkable. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know if it's worth the cost, or I don't know if it pencils from a cost benefits. I haven't done that analysis, but nevertheless, I was very skeptical. And you can go, there's still old Jordan Downs and new Jordan Downs right across the street from each other. And there's retail there, coming back to the point of it following the rooftops, that's working very well, that the Prime Store did. It's a really great field trip to go down there and check out that transformation.
Yeah.
We've underwritten Jordan Downs, so I know it intimately.
Yeah.
And to do things like that, which will happen, it takes a lot of subsidy to do so. What I will tell you on that, if there is a for sale side to Jordan Downs, which I believe will happen, the affordable homes, because the idea is to do market rate, will look exactly the same as the market rate homes. The quality cannot change. I don't care if it's multifamily, for sale, whatever you're building. It's got to be on the inside, not the outside. So you have to have a great structure. We are designing in an SLA deal, because in creativity, surplus land act, we have a couple different deals that we're working with cities, which can act in a way like redevelopment. But we're doing a 900 square foot house. I think we might get to 875. That's 3-bedroom, 2-bath. Okay. By the way, it looks great. What's it have? 1-car garage. What's it have? It doesn't have a walk-in pantry. It doesn't have an ensuite bathroom. You can go walk thousands of homes a mile from here, 2 miles, 3 miles. We have got to get smaller. We have to get more efficient on the building envelope. We got to build faster. There's a lot of factors to it, but the house, I think where the true savings will be is inside the walls. And that's what we all need to focus on, not the building that you're describing in Tokyo. When we're building something, I want to see it 100 years from now, not gone in 10. So it's a little different.
Well, with that, we are a little past our time, and we want to bring up Bill Whitty for his words of wisdom. So let's give the panel our thanks for.
Thank you, Richard.